Thank you so much for tuning in, Dr. Richard Carrier. I appreciate your time. And
yeah, I appreciate your wine.
Yes, and thank you for being a Patreon member of my Patreon, however you want to pronounce it. I really appreciate that. We have a question from Saint Olav, Olav. Josephus, or Josephus's writings about Jesus have been questioned. There's a debate about how much later Christian scribes have changed his original text. But even if these texts are close to the original ones, how reliable are his sources? He wrote this after at least 3 of the Gospels were written. Is it possible that Josephus had the Gospels as his sources and maybe oral tellings by contemporary Christians as well? If so, Josephus as an independent source is weakened?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm convinced that there are no reference to Christianity in Josephus. I think those were all added in various ways, and I've written a lot on that. People can find that. I have an article on my blog, why you can't quote scholarship on Josephus before 2014, because by 2014 and after, so much scholarship came out, including mine, but not mine alone, came out really destroying any hope of believing that there's actual references to Christianity in the original Josephus. But let's take the hypothetical and say that they are, and in fact that they're exactly what Josephus wrote. And there's two passages, right? So there's the Testimonium Flavianum, which is this kind of like ridiculous little vignette about the Jesus story. It's really sloppily written compared to Josephus' style otherwise. But one thing that has happened is Goldberg, and I cite him in that article I just referenced, has demonstrated that the story that's in there, the components of it, actually are derived from the Emmaus narrative in Luke. So quite certainly Josephus, if he'd written that, he almost certainly didn't, but if he did write that, he did get it from the Emmaus narrative in Luke, and so he's using Luke as a gospel, which is a quite late gospel, really. Or he's using some version of that, like a quotation of it somewhere else, who knows. But and then, of course, that establishes that, no, that is not a reliable source. That is the complete absence of corroboration of the story, because Luke's story is made up, and it's late, and has no sources for itself.
Could we imagine Josephus the way he is, picking up a book written like that anonymously to a O Theophilus and saying, "I'll take this information"?
No, absolutely not. Especially since it gets key details wrong. So he would consider it laughable, right? So no, he wouldn't use that as a source. Certainly not. And there's no evidence that he used documents like that as sources. Now there are examples of things where Josephus probably is making stuff up himself, right? But when he's using sources, I think he's doing what most historians do, following the standards of the time, is that you would look for eyewitness historians. You want to get the documents as close to the time as possible. And if you couldn't find that, you wouldn't use it unless you had some sort of propagandistic reason to already agree with it, right? So, and there's no reason Josephus would agree with the TF. The other passage, though, is where he mentions a certain James gets stoned to death, who's the brother of the Jesus called Christ, right? I'm fairly certain the part called Christ was added by Christians later, probably accidentally, in fact. But again, that's people who know my work know that I published under peer review on this, and why I think that's not the case, but why he didn't write those two words. But if he did, well, now we don't really know where he's getting this information, because it doesn't come from the Gospels. It doesn't come from Acts even, because Acts doesn't even have this information in it. We don't know where he's getting the information. We also don't know what he thinks brother of Jesus means, because we know all baptized Christians are brothers of Jesus, right? They're all adopted by God, and so they're all the brethren of the firstborn son of God, right? So if he was just heard a story that this James was called a brother of Christ, brother of Jesus called Christ, then he would just record that as being actual biological brotherhood, not knowing that it's actually a fictive cult term. It doesn't really refer to anything. Or, of course, it could actually mean that it's an actual biological brother of Jesus, who is called the Christ. So any of these things are possible, but there's no way to really figure out what his source would be for this information, or why he would even include it. This is the biggest problem with that passage, is there's no reason for him to add that information in the narrative of his story. And if there was a reason, he would have told us what it was, right? Because that's the normal discourse style of Josephus, which is one of many reasons why we don't think Josephus wrote those words. But if he did, we really don't know what his source is, and we can't really judge its reliability.
So St. Olav said, and one of the things I think is important to pick apart, he wrote this after at least 3 of the Gospels were written.
He's assuming Luke, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, my question is I mean, we can go with consensus because nobody knows when exactly anything was actually written when it comes to the gospel material, right? We make guesses. In fact, they go, well, 75, 85.
Yeah, but the majority position is that Josephus wrote before Luke, and Luke is using Josephus.
Right.
That's what you find in most of the mainstream, most recent commentaries and things like that. But under the conceit, under the assumption that Josephus is using sources, then it's the other way around, where he's using Luke rather than Luke using him.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what the evidence suggests. But if we assume that's the case, then yes, he would have written after 3 Gospels were written.
So one more thing on Josephus, he wanted to get into like independent witness, being an independent witness, blah, blah, blah. There's no way to know.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I wouldn't even say he'd be independent. Even if he did write about Jesus, he would have learned this from someone.
It's absolutely important to establish that you cannot establish it's an independent source, so he's unusable. It's really frustrating to run into that, where you have this source, you can't establish that they're independent, and so they're just not usable as evidence, right? They can't increase the probability of any proposition. Right. That's absolutely true, even if he wrote exactly everything that we have.
And now one more thing on this with Josephus, as we mentioned before, if we take the gist of the areas where Josephus is mentioning Jesus, wouldn't this paint Jesus like the other figures mentioned in Acts, where they're trying to act like, well, Theodus, the Samaritan, all these other figures? Wouldn't have Jesus would have been a nut job like one of them?
So the weird thing is conspicuously the passage, the Testimonium Flavianum, doesn't do that, right? So the thing that Josephus does with all those guys is he specifically says something about them that has them pretending or claiming to be the new Joshua. So they're all going to do something that Joshua did, the famous Joshua who founded Israel originally. So they're going to be the new Joshua who reconquers Israel, right? So it's going to be, they're going to part a river or topple walls magically or whatever. So there's every single one of those does something that Joshua did. And of course, they're also making messianic claims. And so he talks about how they're making these messianic claims. And so they're all Jesus Christ's, really, right? Because Jesus is Joshua. And this is a pattern that Josephus repeats with all of these stories. This pattern is completely absent in the Testimonium Flavianum. So he conspicuously doesn't associate Jesus with those other guys, which is, I think, evidence that he didn't write the Testimonium Flavianum, because absolutely he totally would have done this. It would have been perfect. It would have been gold for him to have done that, but he didn't actually. So, but in terms of the content of the Testimonium Flavianum, even if you took it as what he wrote, it doesn't tell you anything other than what people much later believed about him. It doesn't really, he doesn't refer to any documents that confirm any part of the story, right? So it doesn't really help with anything, right? It doesn't help establish anything.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, in the area it's inserted, of course it doesn't corroborate what I'm saying about the other figures and then comparing Jesus to it. But if there was an insertion there that was completely whitewashed and rewritten,
right? Yeah, if there was a version of it that agreed with the way he depicted those other messianic figures, right? The only thing is if that were the case, no one would have meddled with it. Like, the Christians would have kept it. That's right, because it would have been even more vindicating than the little piece that we have in there now. So the idea that there was some other, like, let's say a hostile hit piece about Jesus, I don't know what it could possibly have said that would indicate that compared to what he says about the other guys. But even if there was, like, there's no evidence that there was, right? Like, that's just pure speculation. And that's what you find in scholarship when they try to rewrite it. When they do try to rewrite it and say, well, maybe he wrote this, it's actually less like Josephine discourse style than the Testimonium Flavianum is. And that is already not even remotely Josephine discourse style. So the reconstructions are even less probable than the Testimonium itself. And that's kind of one of the funny aspects of the scholars who want to try and rescue something here. There is nothing rescuable in this place of the passage. Yeah.
Appreciate it. Thank you. And I really appreciate you, St. Olav. I appreciate you supporting MythVision's Patreon, and to everybody else who does, go down, join the Patreon. Who knows when the next time I can ask your questions to the academics.